between military institutions and juntas. And in some cases we have juntas inside the military institutions and behaving as a junta rather than... but of course, in the military institutions there are, of course, people who are working in the spirit of the constitution of the institution, etc. But still, when we talk about SCAF, about CC, we are not talking about the Quwat al-Musallaha. But the real problem is not the military. The real problem is the civil society. Because they didn't know to overcome this polarization you were mentioning. Polarization between secularists, Islamists, between leftists and rightists. And there are reasons for that. I mean, this polarization doesn't come from... It is rooted in the history of our region, the Arab region, because all the regimes for now 5-6 decades used this as a tool to control the population. Managed to put people in boxes. You are Islamists. You are Democrat. You are nationalists. And then put barriers and walls between them. And fueled tensions and polarizations between them. And that's why I said it before. I think the worst or the main problem in our countries is this polarization, which is an apparent conflict, not a real conflict. Because when people meet, they discover that it's not a big deal. I mean, they can find solutions really easily. They find a huge common ground. Yes, please.
If I could just come back to the point you mentioned, pressuring parties into mediation. We earlier looked at the UN guidelines to mediation. Yeah. And one of the elements was that it's a process where the parties consent to the mediation.
Yeah.
So how does that balance with pressuring someone into participating? Wouldn't then kind of have a negative effect on how they participate?
Now, I mentioned this intervention only in one case when you have imbalance of power. When one party is strong enough and he ignores the other. He's not willing to engage in a dialogue or in a mediation process. So how do you do with that kind of situation? Especially if he's committing crimes against the other party. You have to, the international community or the regional powers or organizations have responsibility to try, but they have to be fair. Any party who pretends to do this kind of work has to be strong enough to be to have credibility, to have a capacity to influence on things, and to be fair. Otherwise, you will create more problems than you solve, and impartial. And I don't say neutral. I say impartial. Nobody is neutral. We all have affinities. We all have good feelings or bad feelings towards one party or the other. But even if we are not neutral, we have to be impartial. That means that we treat the parties equally.
Would it make it better then if the pressuring was done by someone different than the mediator? Because
yes, sure,
yeah,
sure.
Because if you pressure someone into
sure.
participating, and then you're the mediator.
No, this approach will help going to this one or to this one. So now we see that the mediation is one way of dealing with conflict. And even in mediation, we have different kinds of mediation, as you know. And here I'll show you a number of types of mediation. We have individual or group mediation. Yesterday we had co-mediation, now we have two co-mediators. We can have pure mediation or mediation with muscle, and here you have the party that exerts pressure is the same that is mediating, and the best example for this is, for instance, the Dayton Accord in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where you had all group who is very muscle, style of mediator, just to come to the mediation room and knock at the table and threaten, and it worked. Well, it led. I said that it worked. I don't say it gave a good result. At the end, they signed the agreement, and Ali Izzet Begovic said, "I signed the document with a broken heart, or with a bleeding heart." I can't remember the exact expression. But this is just to show that you can have this kind of mediation with muscle, but of course it's not like pure mediation based on conviction. Yeah.
If I can just step in, because I have a tendency to agree with Alex. I'd be really concerned actually about very forceful mediation, because I mean Bosnia is exactly the example. It doesn't work.
No.
It didn't work. I mean, yes, there's a peace agreement, but it does not work. And people didn't. I mean, people don't want it. Most of them.
Yeah.
So I mean.
No, it didn't work. No, I said no. It worked in the sense that they reached an agreement. They signed an agreement. But now I agree. I fully agree that I was the first one at that time to say that this is not going to be. Yeah, it's not viable. But it is one way of doing things. This kind of mediation exists in real world. The Taif agreement in Saudi Arabia that solved the Lebanese civil war was also based on mediation of muscle. And the Arab Ballbrook is Lahbab Ibrahimi, who was in Syria. And he has the same, more or less the same style. Yes?
Is it?
I agree with a similar reaction, but I guess that is the matter of terminology also. What is happening in ex-Yugoslavia, I wouldn't call mediation, I would call it arbitration, even with certain agendas of envoys coming to the region, They had their points that they had to fulfill and to report back to whichever organization or country it was. So I understand your explanation, but I would still, and they call it publicly mediation, but that is not mediation. I mean, that is arbitration with a really strong hand, as you said. So, then you can add, I guess.
Yeah, actually, I agree with you and Christian. Is it important whether mediator is actually oriented towards results or his or her own agenda? Because Hong is a good example of someone who is doing mediation for, at least in my opinion, for his own reputation. So to be presented,
Not only for his reputation, but for the interests of the United States.
but it became, I don't know, for me it looks now that this international mediation is now very important for individuals to gain something more. We see RTSI getting Nobel Prize winner. I have an impression that all mediators in international conflict see themselves as Nobel Prize winner at some point. So if you solve enough conflicts, or you disqualified, and then you have to speed up the process of solving them.
No, Nobel Prize after Obama. So you have also insider. This is a very important issue. Insider mediation. If you are inside the conflict, part of the conflict, and you want to do something and you have the will, just don't refrain from doing it. Just because you are a party and you say, no, I can't, I'm too... No, you can do it. And there are examples of people who did this kind of mediation. And I remember my friend, the late Deha, you knew her?
Deha Ibrahim?
Deha Ibrahim.
Yeah.
She's a wonderful lady. She's very lovely. she used to do this kind of mediation. And once she told us about a very simple trick she used to differentiate between the roles. She said, I had a scarf, or how do you call it, this kind this around the neck. You have,
Yeah, scarf.
yeah. She had the scarf, and whenever she was having the role of mediator, she would put the scarf. And whenever she wants to express herself as from the standpoint of one party, she removes the. It's feasible. There are only conditions, and the conditions are to be fair, to be impartial, to be this kind of. But yeah.
Don't you think this kind of mediation is getting less common now? I mean, if
Inside
the
the
start, no, mediation with master.
we mustn't. Just forget it. Forget I want to spend it's no. It's
Because I think with the history and the stories has been showing that maybe it really doesn't work. So maybe
no. I think it will last. It will be here everywhere. Every time when a superpower or a regional power have a stake on a conflict, and then this power uses the word mediation in order to go in and influence the process. In my view, this is going to be always present. And then you have a culturally balanced mediation, and I will say a few words on that because we have. I want to show an experience of our foundation on this type of mediation. And then you have facilitation. And facilitation, it's a less, more informal way of mediating. I mean, you just, if I simplify things, I would say that when you do facilitation, you only take care of the logistics and you don't intervene in the content. And then you have good offices, when you have people, well-known people shuttling between the two parties to explore. And problem solving, as I told you, when you have training sessions and helping people to learn to solve problems. Yes.
I hate to step back, but in the definition of conflict, you mentioned individual groups and civilizations.
Yes.
How do you actually define that? For example, maybe the Second World War was Western civilization, basically destroying itself, or groups of conflict.
Yeah.
But now I think the word, at least in the U.S., is clash of civilizations between Islam and Western civilization. I mean, how do you actually, what is your view on that? Is it a clash of civilizations? And if so, how do you actually mediate that? I think even in the US they haven't decided, it's called a war on terrorism.
Yeah.
So it's just a kind of a gray area, I think, hard to define.
Now, in the definition, I added these groups just to show that conflicts can be, you have the typology of conflicts, micro, meso, micro, and mega, the 4 types. Of course, for me, World War II is a macro. It's not a mega conflict between two regions or two civilizations. I have a problem with this expression of clash of civilizations.
So I
I prefer Edward Said's clash of ignorances. So it rather conveys the there are what seems to be a clash between civilizations is rooted in 2 things. One thing is ignorance of the other, and it goes both ways. And the other thing is the instrumentalization of this ignorance by powers in order to achieve some goals, political or economic.
And how you found this ignorance?
Yeah. No, but as I told you, in the same city, you have people who don't know each other
Yes.
and are in confrontation. So this is a fortiori valid for countries who are far away from each other.
So in your definition, is there room for conflict of ideologies? And if so, how do you actually resolve that?
Yeah, we'll come to this kind.
Okay.
We are just in the beginning of. Yeah.
I guess when it comes to the type of mediation that is facilitation, I guess this is what Brigitte has been sharing with us. At some points, you don't want to go and mediate, and
Yes.
but
Exactly.
you are just
Yeah,
facilitating
exactly.
the process.
Yeah.
And it's not only also about logistics, but also about
The process.
to put the process, to put
yeah.
the questions that might invite the people to reflect upon the situations, and for them to come up with sustainable
Yeah.
solution.
Exactly. So it's a light form of mediation, which where the mediator, in the extreme case, take care of only the logistics, the meeting room and the hotel and the flight tickets, and in an intermediate or median way, it takes care of the process, of the timekeeping, the balance of hours, etc. And then, in a stronger form, it is also intervening in the content and suggesting in a clever way solutions.
Well, this is the case of the Philippine government and the Communist Party,
Yeah,
facilitated by Norway.
yeah,
They will never call for a meeting unless both parties call for a meeting.
yeah.
They will never ask them to go to Oslo and negotiate if there is no agreement between the two
Mhm.
parties. And they will not make the first step.
Yeah,
They will always wait for the two parties.
yeah,
And they call this sometimes soft mediation.
yes. Okay. Let's go to, culturally balanced immigration. I don't know if you remember in 2005, 2006, we had this crisis between the West and the Muslim world related to the cartoons, to the Danish cartoons, you remember? So in January 2006, when things went really bad and we had protests in the Arab streets and a few dead people who died, and there was a boycott on the Danish product, we were asked to mediate or maybe to facilitate a dialogue between the Danes and representatives from the Arab world. And this is what I would like to show. So this is the source of the conflict, this kind of drawing cartoons that were produced by a Danish newspaper. Especially this one was very helpful. This one, the prophet symbolized by a bomb, and this really helped. Awesome. So the face of Muhammad cartoons, 20 September 2005, demonstrations of about 5,000 people from the Muslim community in Denmark. The cartoons were reproduced by many other newspapers.
Wow, this was not very clever.
Hmm?
From the media point of view, this is not very
But this is for the media also, or for some part of the opinion. This is freedom of expression. This is the conflicting. And then there was an intense popular, widespread anger in the Muslim world. I just finish with this slide. Then Rasmussen did a big mistake. Rasmussen, who is in NATO now. He refused to receive Arab ambassadors. And this was was felt very badly by the ambassadors, by the governments of the Arab world. And then you had for the first time maybe in Arab history, an agreement between the streets and populations and the governments and the regime. And then acts of violence in the Arab streets. 13 February 2006, we were asked to facilitate. Yes?
Just fact checking, because during that crisis, it was in the newspapers that in some Arab countries there were even pictures reproduced that weren't drawn by that guy, but they were just inventions, and it's like oil on the fire, and it just...
Probably. You know, when you are in that kind of crisis, you can have, anything can happen. You know, even Swiss flags were burned because they confused them with...
It's, just to add on it, because yesterday I told somebody that we had a mediation game once before, and in that game we actually had a party playing the role of the media, because during mediation you really don't want things like this getting bigger or adding or changing, or that really doesn't help either.
If you are interested in the role of media in war journalism, peace journalism, then there is a good reference I can suggest, which is, maybe you know it maybe, by Jackie Lynch and Johan Galtung. I can give you the reference if you want.
What is it called?
Peace and conflict journalism.
Yeah, peace and conflict journalism. It's we translated it in Arabic if you want. It's online on our website. You can have it on a PDF.
So would you characterize this as a conflict of civilizations then? I mean, according to the definition. According to your definition, I'm just...
But propaganda,
Yeah,
it's
but
much
for me this is a mega conflict between civilizations.
Oh, okay.
It's not that it's not prepared. The media has a logic different from
I think the media has its own agenda. They have to sell their
Exactly. That's their argument. Their argument is that peace and peaceful events don't sell.
Yes,
Yeah, but
yes.
okay, that's why we have to
There is one more element.
They're honest.
I think that we are forgetting also one important element when it comes to media. Who owns that particular medium?
Yeah,
And,
of course.
and whose interests are represented too?
So,
And that's not prepared enough in humanistic way.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. There is a need for huge,
But in other
Some of
ways,
training.
we can find also many other cartoons or video on or YouTube free from people and peaceful and in other way, if you want to buy this cartoon,
Yeah.
you can, but if you don't
Yeah. Well, social media are changing.
Yes.
Yes.
Let's carry on.
Yes.
And then maybe have a discussion after the... the negotiators, people who were around the table. So you had, from the Muslim side, we had three big transnational organizations that were really acting on the streets and influencing the protesters. That is the Global Anti-Aggression Campaign, the International Committee of Support of the Final Prophet, and the Union of Muslim Scholars. And from the Danish side, you had three people mandated by the Foreign Affairs, an ambassador, a bishop, and a professor of Islamic studies. These were the teams negotiating. How was the table set up? We had three Danes and two Muslims negotiating. And then it was complicated because one of the Danes was Muslim. The ambassador was Muslim, so it's and then what we had is that I was co-facilitating with a colleague of mine who is a lady who is from Spain, but she is Swiss, but originally from Spain, Christian. I am Muslim, male Muslim, female Christian. That's why we call it culturally balanced co-mediation, because there are two mediators. Each one of them is close to, culturally, is close to one party. And then to add another complexity, the 1 day or 2 days before the meeting, the Danish ambassador in Geneva called me and said, I want to ask a favor. Is it possible at this stage? I said, no, just go ahead. He said, we would like to bring with us an advisor. I said, no problem, you can come with as many advisors as you wish. I said, no, look, he's Muslim. I said, yeah, perfect. So they brought with them an advisor. So what I did to keep a balance, I asked Johan Galtung to be advisor for the Muslim team. So at the end we had Tariq Ramadan, maybe some of you know him, who was advising the Danes, and Johan Galtung was advising the Muslims. So that's why I call it a cross-advisor, culturally balanced co-mediation. Okay, lessons learned. Useful role of the co-mediators in confidence building. Because when you see that in the mediation team there is a person who is close to you culturally, it's only perception, even if it's not. Then you are more keen to engage in the process. The useful role of the cross-advisors in one, understanding the other's point of view, very useful, because he has the capacity to talk about how the other is viewing things, and also for convincing the other. For instance, Tariq Ramadan was talking to the Muslim delegation and saying, but you shouldn't do this, we Muslims, we should behave like that. And Johan Galtung was addressing the Danes. No, but you should ask your queen to apologize for what the role of the ambassador was very confusing, because he was at the same time Dane, official, ambassador, serving the interests of his government, and at the same time he was Muslim. And he was playing both roles. Sometimes he was saying, we Muslims in Denmark, we are suffering from this thing, and you should help us to. And 30 seconds later, you said, we the government. This was very. Yes.
Do you think this was on purpose, that they sent him for this, so that he can balance?
Sure.
So he was playing a role somehow, to some extent.
They chose a Muslim to have a facility.
And him, and my question is also himself. If he was on one hand with the Muslim and on the other hand with the Danish official, do you think it was coming from his heart, or was he playing his role as ambassador?
That's what I felt. He was playing, and this made him.
But it was a bad choice to have him.
Yeah, exactly.
Depending what you want.
For the Danish government.
Is it possible?
He was serving the Danish interests by playing the role of the Muslim states.
All right.
Is it possible to have a situation where somebody plays both roles and it works? Because they're self-aware and they are quite clear about saying what they can do and what they can't do. Let's say they have an official capacity and they say, look, at this point I'm an official, but I support as much as I can what you're doing. But ultimately, there will be only some things that we can do.
It's possible, yes, but you have to be honest.
Yeah, exactly.
You have to be transparent and honest. The very moment when you give the impression that you are playing and comedy, then it's.
Okay.
And the other parts failed. They realized that he was playing.
Yes, yeah, of course. That's why I'm saying that it's confusing. The other party was telling me, why did they send us this Muslim? Who want to talk to? spoilers. In mediation, you have, of course, you have to map the conflict, to look at the actors, to the principal, main actors, secondary actors, etc., stakeholders, but also you have to identify the spoilers. This is a big issue. I think whenever you are in a mediation process, if you ignore the spoilers, you'll get trouble.
In that case,
I will tell you. I will tell you. In this case, the spoilers were people with good intention, not with bad intention. You know, when we finished this 4-hour talk in Geneva, we agreed to meet a second time after 1 week, because what happened, and this is important for the rest of my talk, it seems as if it is a war of religion or clash of, but in reality, and I will address this issue later on, it has nothing to do with religion. It has to do with politics,
yes,
with economy, but I will discuss this later. So the Danes went with a list of requests or claims, and they said we will consult with our government and then we will meet in the, and some of the requests is just withdraw from Iraq, withdraw from Afghanistan. We have enough with aggression against Muslims. You know, this kind of and in between, in this week, there was another initiative by Muslim scholars. Maybe some of you know them, Amr Khalid and Swaydan. They are preachers. They are familiar with, you know, talking about Islamic tradition, Islamic history, Islamic ethics, but they are not mediators, they are not trained in conflict resolution. So what they did, they proposed to go to Denmark and to take with them a group of youth, 20 boys, and then have a conference to say that Islam is beautiful and Islam is peace, and the ambassador and the Danish government just went and so they organized a big event, well, a conference, an afternoon conference, and the Danes, they brought 20 girls, so they met in a meeting room and exchanged, say we are all brothers and sisters, we want peace. And in that case, the Danish government overcome the initial. That's why I call it spoiler action.
And so they didn't come back?
They didn't come back because they had some people who are easier negotiators, who are not negotiators at all, who came just and said we are brothers and sisters, and we are going to call for calm in the Arab streets. But this didn't happen, because those two scholars had problems with the authorities who mandated the delegation to talk with the Danes. So there were troubles after between the Muslim scholars.
That's why I'm convinced that through training for peace, we must teach to people how to stay far from a kind of information on mass media. You must teach how to read, how to connect to other people through mass media, because everywhere we can find this kind of.
Who is a timekeeper? Just because I'm not looking at my watch. You tell me when we have a break and when we. I trust you. Now, is there a religious dimension in a conflict? I will show you this very famous picture. You are familiar with the onion, the positions, interests, and needs. Just to underline the fact that when you deal with the conflict you have, it's vital, it's fundamental that you go through this kind of exploration. And there are different categories of conflicts. If you look at the goals here, and the positions, the goals in contradiction and the positions in opposition, you can have 4 types of conflicts. You can have conflicts where you have religious or ethnic also, because there are similarities, and I will give you some examples. These are identity markers, both of them, that are expressed in religious or ethnic positions. This is case. This is square A. You can have conflicts of political or socio-economic ground expressed in religious or ethnic position. You can have the other also situations where you have a conflict with religious or ethnic ground expressed in political, socio-economic positions, and you can have political, socio-economical expressed in political, socio-economic. And yeah, someone wanted to. And from my experience in the Arab world, most of the conflicts are in this square.
D.
D.
So religious, ethnic, political, socio-economic?
Yeah, the positions, the declared positions, the discourses are religious or ethnic. But the root causes, the goals and contradictions are political or social. If you take Sudan, what happened in South Sudan, the discourse was religious, but in reality, what was the issues were political and socio-economic. It was about development,
about greed of power, of
exactly,
global power.
exactly, about injustice, about the absence of democracy.
Just so I understand this, it appeared to me the conflict was about the right to speech, free speech, and also respect of religious ideas. So maybe I'm saying that wrong.
I'm not saying that there are no conflicts in A. I'm just saying that most of the conflicts in the Arab world are here in B. And some of them, of course, they include the elements of identity, cultural identity, religious.
So with the Danish article, how would you graph that? Is it B or would it be?
For me, it's B.
Okay.
It's B, because what the Muslim delegation said had nothing to do with religion. They didn't say, well, you are disbelievers. They said, we are aggressed, the Muslim community, the Muslim Ummah is aggressed constantly by the West. We are occupied, your army is in Afghanistan, your army is in Iraq. We are suffering, we are, our oil is taken by the West. That's the...
But the street had a different view. It seemed like this is more of a pretext or an opportunity. It's really not about the conflict.
No, the street has a different discourse.
Okay.
And I will explain why.
Sorry, it's just...
No problem. No, just go ahead, don't hesitate. So, as I said, it's B, mainly, not. Why is it like this? First, because there is a failure to master the political language or the economic language. Due to a political deadlock and the impoverishment of political culture in the Arab world after decades of occupation and dictatorship. When you don't have the tools, the political jargon, you can't express your claims in a political discourse. You are only familiar with the religious discourse. You know, the Trotskyists in the 70s in the Arab world, they were using
Communist?
dialectic.
Dialectic.
Yeah, not communist, Marxist dialectics, because they mastered it. So you had movements in the Arab world, all over the Arab world, leftists were very, very strong in that. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, I was impressed by the way these leaders, leftist leaders, were good in rhetoric and dialectics.
But this is also a semantic problem, because semantic problem is the background of language, semantic and means tools, lack of tools, or also lack of development.
Yeah, that's why I say it's a failure to master this kind of tools. And if you are only familiar with a religious language, then you use a religious language. Osama bin Laden, when he says that the West is infidel or disbeliever, and I will come to that, you have to decode it, you have to translate it, and to translate it to another expression, which is U.S. Army, get out of Saudi Arabia.
Right.
Take your military bases from our land. That's the.
I think what's occurring to me now is that there seems to be the politics are in two different squares. In the West, we totally separate church and state.
Yeah.
So we would only operate in D.
Yeah.
Whereas I think it's that separation doesn't exist. So you really never come into this.
But in the Arab and Muslim world, you have to have the four
I see.
Four squares.
Okay, thanks.
And
do you really think that, though? I mean, if I look at Israel and Palestine, I think in the States a lot of the siding with Israel, in certain parts of American society is very much a religious-driven position. You know,
I think it's.
But it's not the mainstream.
It's
not the mainstream.
But I think we in the West sometimes think that for us politics and religion is more separated than it actually is. I would rather put it like that. I think, we are hiding a bit better that they are. So well separated.
That's true.
Okay, and there is another thing also, is the nature of the language, the religious language, the Islamic religious language. There's a lot of values referring to fairness, to justice. So it's easy for Muslims to use this kind of rhetoric. And also, and this is very important also, I would like you to be also attentive to this. In the public opinion in the Muslim world, there is a feeling that the international system of positive law consistently fails to address their questions. They feel that there are double standards. Maybe the last Gaza aggression, the last aggression on Gaza is one example, and you see how Europe and the United States reacted, and how they reacted to what happened in Ukraine when we had 70 or 80 victims. Then you ask yourself, are they really applying international law? Or are they applying it only when it suits them? So there is a tendency to come back to our own system of law, Islamic law. Yes, who wanted to say?
Just in this context, how to interpret positive law?
Forget about positive, international law.
Okay.
It's not only about all the conventions and UN conventions and humanitarian.
No.
The whole system of human rights and humanitarian law.
But I think the positive law is right in there. I think it is a man-made law as opposed to
Yes,
to
yes.
the interpretation.
Yeah, but
of
I
the
didn't want to go into this. But
Sorry.
it's just, yeah.
Forget it. Okay, sorry.
But this is, you understood this.
Yeah.
You wanted just to maybe to discuss further. I mean,
I thought maybe it's something different than I'm thinking it is, but if it's, it
yeah,
has to do with
because it's a complicated issue. I could talk. We could have a discussion on that.
I don't doubt that.
You know, even in Islam, in the Muslim world, even in the Muslim world, there is no Islamic law. There are Islamic guidance, Islamic guiding principles, and the law is by definition positive because it's made by people. But the law, the Islamic law, is made in compliance with the Islamic principles. So when it comes, when we talk about Sharia, Sharia is not a set of law as we understand in the West. It's a set of principles, it's a framework, but the law has to be derived by the people, taking into account the place and time context. The law in Arabia in the 7th century is different from the law in Scandinavia in the 21st century. But both have to comply to the reference, the set of.
It questioned also the universality of human rights, you know.
Yes.
It was a question with Tunisian constitution.
Yeah.
You know, because
This is also a big issue.
human rights have been written by
Yeah.
Western countries.
Yeah. This is one element.
Yes.
This is one element because some of the Muslim groups they say that we were not associated in drafting these rights.
All the semantic.
Yeah, and the other thing,
What does it mean?
yeah, and the other thing is the hierarchy of rights. Of course, there is a core, hardcore of rights that are shared by all human beings. But when you extend it further and further, then you will come, you will encounter some difficulties to make them universal.
It asks also the legitimacy of the international institution, you know, because.
Yeah, you're right. The UN now in the Muslim world has
Yes.
almost no credibility, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Now, but often, even if they belong to B square, often they are perceived or regarded falsely as belonging to A. And here the explanation is that often there is a lack of effort committed to analyze the type of conflict and to explore the real underlying issues. If we have only a superficial approach to conflict, then we might, because we hear only religious discourse, Allah, God, Sharia, Jesus, then we don't get to a point where we understand what is beneath. And then there is another reason, which is that sometimes one party or some parties of the conflict, they have an interest in portraying the conflict as being religious. And I give you, for example, an example, the Algerian conflict. It was portrayed in Western media as a religious, as a war between the Enlightenment and the darkness, between, the modernism and Algeria in the 90s. And this is because the Algerian military were, through their media channels, you know, they were sending this false impression to international media, portraying the opponent as being as a religious fanatist, you know, fundamentalist, etc. Even though the conflict is fundamentally political in the 90s. There were elections, and one party won the election. This party had a religious reference, and the military intervened to interrupt the democratic process. As simple as that. So it's about power, about power sharing or power accessing to power. It has nothing to do with religion. Both the military and the population are Muslims. They don't have any.
I think Iraq started. It was our involvement in Iraq. A was a pretext for D.
Yeah, Iraq started B, and now it's going to A.
You think it started at B and went to A?
Yeah.
Okay.
I fear that makes me really worry about the future. Because it's now
used as pretext.
it's becoming a real sectarian.
It's learning, yes.
Okay, and sometimes also you have a third party that has an interest in portraying the conflict as. And I can give you the bottom, or what's happening in Mali, for instance, or in the Sahel in general. Sahel also, it's a problem of development in Mali. It's between the south and the north. Pure problem of development. But the French, among others, they describe it as Islamists and jihadists and all these words that you are now familiar with. If we have time, we can go through all these words, just to make the difference. And
Nigeria also?
Nigeria, it's a mixture. Of course, there is the
dispute at the beginning, but then it became more and more religious. So it's
Yeah.
more instrumentalization of it.
Exactly, but basically it was about also the underdevelopment of. Okay, so now the technique that we use, and it's simple and complex at the same time. It's very easy because when we have this kind of situations, we have to transform to try to solve the problem in another space, not in the apparent space. And this, we borrowed this method to some transformational methods used in mathematics and physical science. Well, this is the influence of my background in physics. This method consists of transforming the equations and reformulating them in a space where the resolution is easier. Then reconverting the solution and formulating it in the origin space. And I will explain what this. So, it's a 6-step process. First step, listen directly to the parties at conflict, separately, and avoid relays that may alter the discourse and create a bias. When you go to mediate, you don't educate yourself about the conflict through media. You go to talk to the party and start on a one-on-one basis. Don't bring them in a dialogue room or a mediation room. Start with each one separately and have a direct access to what they say. And then try to decode the language used by the parties at conflict and translate it in terms of goals. And this transformation allows the transition from religious to the political. Then analyze the goals of the parties and identify the contradictions. Then proceed with legitimization of the goals in their law system or systems. This can be problematic if you have parties that belong to different cultures or law systems. Then the process of legitimization has to be done through the system of the party you are dealing with. It doesn't. It has no. It's nonsense to go and talk, for instance, to a Muslim group and use a Norwegian law system of legitimization. You have to be aware of the Muslim law system and try to see if
were strongly invested and their way of understanding was through a religious discourse. Even though you might have identified that their needs are actually social, economic, and political, how do you get from them having that realization and that way that discourse changes? Does that make sense? There must be a point where even the people themselves, who might, I'm imagining this a bit, who might be obviously still using a very religious language, come to the realization that even though the way they're articulating many of these things in a religious way, but actually that awareness for themselves is social economic.
That's exactly what I wanted
to move on.
That's exactly what I wanted.
What happens right in there?
When you mediate a conflict like this, you solve a contradiction. But at the same time, you contribute in the education of both parties to understand and know, because you are there interacting with each other. And that's exactly what we've been doing in the field of human rights since the 90s. You know, at that time, when I was talking about human rights, I was considered as an alien person, someone corrupted by the West, because I lived too long in Britain and Switzerland. You're talking about human rights. We don't have such a terminology in Quran and in the Sunnah of Prophet. And then either you enter into confrontation with them and try to force them to use the modern language, and then or you try to translate all the wording of the human rights international law into an accessible language to them, and then show them that there is no contradiction between it's only a way of naming things. And believe me, in 10, 15 years, now the most radicals of those people who were treating me as a bad Muslim are becoming advocates of human rights. They set up human rights NGOs in the Gulf states, in the Arab world. But you have to go progressive and you have to respect also people. Not to come and try to force them to what you believe is right, is modern.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I think we should have a small break.
Yes.
Yes. 10 minutes maximum.
Yes. Thank you.
She mentioned that.
Were strongly invested and their way of understanding was through a religious discourse. Even though you might have identified that their needs are actually social, economic, and political, how do you get from them having that realization and that way that discourse changes? Does that make sense? There must be a point where even the people themselves, who might, I'm imagining this a bit, who might be obviously still using a very religious language, come to the realization that even though the way they're articulating many of these
Yeah,
things in a religious way, but actually that awareness for themselves
Yeah, sure.
is social economic.
That's exactly what I
So you
wanted.
can move on. How do you-
That's exactly what I
What
wanted.
happens right in there?
When you mediate a conflict like this, you solve a contradiction. But at the same time, you contribute in the education of both parties
Yeah.
to understand
Yeah.
and know,
Yeah.
because you are there interacting with each other.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we've been doing in the field of human rights since the 90s. You know, at that time, when I was talking about human rights, I was considered as an alien person, someone corrupted by the West, because I lived too long in Britain and Switzerland. Talking about human rights, we don't have such a terminology in Quran and in the Sunnah of Prophet. And then either you enter into confrontation with them and try to force them to use the modern language, and then or you try to translate all the wording of the human rights international law into an accessible language to them, and then show them that there is no contradiction between it's only a way of naming things. And believe me, in 10, 15 years, now the most radicals of those people who were treating me as a bad Muslim are becoming advocates of human rights. They set up human rights NGOs in the Gulf states, in the Arab world. But you have to go progressive, and you have to respect also people. Not to come and try to force them to what you believe is right, is modern.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I think we should have a small break.
Yes.
Yes. 10 minutes maximum.
Yes. Thank you.
You know, she mentioned that. Very good.
We are talking about this issue of polarization with our friend Misri, the Egyptian. His name means the Egyptian.
What?
His name means the Egyptian, and he's from Egypt. Al-Misri. And polarization, yeah, it's really it's a big problem in the Arab world. And we were talking about this experience. He also he's gone through the same kind of experience when we put people together. You know, we had once a workshop in Tunisia, and we had people from all the ideological spectrum, from different countries, from Yemen, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Mauritania, Morocco. And then you have, imagine the setting, where you have 30 or 40 people. You have a radical feminist, you have a radical Islamist, you have a radical secularist, you have, and then you put them together, and then they've never met. And the only thing they know about each other that the other is really Satan. He's ready to cut your throat, or she's ready to. And then they you know, it's a 2 or 3 days workshop, and the first session is really difficult because you have electricity in the air, you have exchange of you know,
missiles.
Huh?
Missiles?
Verbal missiles. Huh? These people with beards really want to bring us to Middle Ages. This lady wants to spread, corruption in the city. And then slowly and gradually they will listen to this discourse to the Avar, and they will observe and see that the Avar is a human being, has emotions, has rights, has genuine, claims that are reasonable. And then at the end of the third day, believe me, that there is a real transformation. So only putting people together is useful. That's the message. So now, facts, interpretation, a source of conflict. Whenever you have translation or interpretation, you have to be cautious. And this is true for discourses, text, and images. What's this?
A map?
What's wrong with it?
It's an old map.
It's what?
It's very old.
It's turned around. Can you express it in other words?
So it's
Upside down?
I'm from Australia, it depends on the perspective.
That's the key word. Bravo, that's the key word. It depends on which perspective. This is an image. This is by the way, this is the tabula rogeriana drawn by Al-Idrisi, who is a Muslim geographer. He did it for Roger II of Sicily in the 12th century. And Arab geographers at that time, they used to draw maps like this, where you have here Africa, Africa,
okay.
the peninsula, Italy, or Norway is here, probably. And then you have, and this was the normal way to draw.
Why would Africa be, well, north? Basically?
It's a convention. North is not necessarily urban. It's only convention. We have now a convention that the north is urban. But other people used to have another convention. North is down. So you have to be aware of that. That something that seems obvious for you might be not at all obvious for others. This is very, very...
Because language created cultural conventions,
Yeah.
but we have to keep in mind that your
That's the origin of all the problem.
And you know about, cartography is highly ideological. You know about this.
Oh, yeah.
You can read, there are books, and textbooks on that, how the maps are drawn, the size of the continents, the size of, there is a huge load of ideology. And there is now a school, political school in the Arab world who are saying we should come back to the original mapping, because our vital space is here, is not in Europe. The European Union don't bother about our future, about what we need, about our basic needs. Our normal, natural background is here, and vital space. It looks funny, yeah? Africa when it's drawn like this. But it's a way to look at it. I'll, just to have 5 minutes exercise to change a bit. I will show you this picture with some factual elements and ask a couple of you to describe the image, what you see it in the image. Just a few, take a few seconds, and then I will just, or you can volunteer it. Let's see. So it's during Friday prayer in Paris. There is a prayer room nearby. It's Rue Le Poissonnier, and it's in 2009. So, who wants to start?
I see Muslim men.
You see Muslim
Because
men?
of you can see some of them are having the, I don't know, the English word.
Yes. Yeah,
Yes,
sure.
exactly, and in front of as well.
Yeah, okay. African style, yeah. Then?
The shoes are taken off.
The shoes are taken off, yes.
There are only men.
Only men. So imagine you are a reporter, you are a journalist, and you want to report on that picture.
But
Only men.
this is not complete description. They saw that, but they don't describe all the picture. Because I see it differently.
So try to complete. Yeah.
There is two people walking,
Okay.
and on the left is normal people. We can see any sign on, and the right, on the right, yeah.
Car.
I imagine a religious woman, you know.
Here.
The person stood walking
Here.
and
To the left.
and with
Right there, on the left, second person.
The two people walking, the one is black.
the one in black.
Okay.
No,
No,
on
Yes.
the
just on the left side of the picture.
Non, la personne debout, la noire.
I see.
A religious person, I see.
Probably.
I guess.
Probably. Yeah, it's a guess. Yeah.
I think without the words, I wouldn't have think about religion.
Yes.
With the words, it's obvious it's about religion.
Yes.
It may not be correct.
Now, that's why I gave these elements to put you in context. But I want you to be in the role of a reporter and say in a few sentences what you see. That's all. Yeah, please.
Well, it kind of has this strange clash in a way that, like, it's a street. A street is for driving and walking.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then at the same time, it's being used for something stationary.
Yeah.
So, you know, to someone it might seem like there's some incongruence to it.
Yeah. Okay. Please.
Well, it could be that the people are waiting for something on the street, something that's coming.
Right.
But if you want to have another
Wait.
interpretation.
Yeah, that's easy. They're waiting for the sermon and for the prayer. That's
Yeah,
all.
but you could also say, if you don't know anything about
Yeah,
it, could be
yeah.
that all the people turn their back to the people walking on the other side.
Yeah.
So just
Okay.
imagine.
Yes, please.
I'm really surprised that they're out on the street already with their shoes off, because as I know, you can only enter a mosque if you're clean,
Yeah.
and you will get dirty feet with your shoes off on the street, so I'm really confused by
No, it's about the
They pray
purpose.
outside.
I'm just quickly following Alex. It's the use of a public space for something that's normally held in a private space.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about shoes because it's in the center of the picture. So maybe the accent of the picture is to show that when people pray, they take off the shoes, even if it's on the street.
Good. So one thing that comes out of these descriptions is that the factual elements are important to describe what you see in the picture. And then you have, everyone has a different way of describing things. And here I will show you two reports from two journalists from two different backgrounds. And you'll see how they describe the scene. So I'll start with Maxime Lepante, who says that Muslims await the beginning of the conquer terrain, sitting illegally on their mats on the sidewalk. Non-Muslims are expelled from the confiscated street.
Occupied.
In this area of Paris, it's the Muslims who are now making the law, not the French authorities.
Occupied territory.
Yeah.
Maxime Lepante,
Is that
is
a-
he a journalist? Maxime Lepante, c'est Front National? Ah bah, ça
It could be.
Is that real?
Ça sent le vin. The ladies were asking if he's from the right wing. Extreme right wing. Sorry. Extreme right wing. Extreme right wing. No, this is in a real journal.
It was a.
Yeah, I can find the reference. Now the second one was not published, but it was a description of someone I know. When he saw this, I did the exercise with him. French, who lives in Paris.
Why it wasn't published?
Sorry?
Why it wasn't published, the second one?
Because it wasn't a journal. He wasn't. He wasn't a journalist in a newspaper. I attempted. I tried to have the view of the other side of the Muslim community to compare. And this guy from the Muslim community, Muhammad Mabrouk, that's what he says. The Muslim community of Abbas await the beginning of the Friday prayer. So here, factually, they are similar. Then the poorly heated garage used as prayer room in the neighborhood is too small. Okay. The Muslim community of this area of Paris feel abandoned by the French authorities who refuse to allow them having properties. So, depending on which ground you are, which background you have, which ideological, sources you've been feeling, then you have another interpretation of facts. So we should be very, very careful about. Now let's come to conflicts related to values. Sorry. Can you give me just examples of conflicts of values? But in real
Well,
life.
the advice would be that, I think it was mentioned earlier this week, that here in Europe we tend to think that the state takes care of the children and education for children, whereas in a lot of other countries, people tend to think that it's more of a family affair.
Yeah. Yeah, for instance. Yeah.
Like property should be, there shouldn't be private property, some people think. There shouldn't be, some people think there should.
Yes, abortion, life.
Okay. So what we see that we can have this kind of clash or conflict based on values within the same community or the same country. It doesn't necessarily happen only between different cultures or different countries. We can have conflict of values within the same community. Yes?
I wanted to say, even within the same family, when the family migrates to another country,
Exactly.
children raised
Exactly.
with different values, then you have
Exactly. Yes?
And in my country, amongst the Christian society,
Yeah.
there is a group that believes in virginity testing for girls,
Yeah.
and a group that says it's violation of
Yeah.
rights. So that's conflict of
Okay, so I have just picked up a few examples. For instance, between groups of different cultural backgrounds, we have, for instance, a clash between democracy as a philosophical doctrine versus the Islamic dogma. These are real conflict of values. Democracy not as not instrumental democracy, not democracy as mechanisms of managing the political life, but as a philosophical doctrine, it's clashing with the Islamic dogma. And this is a conflict between two cultural backgrounds. But you can have also conflicts within the same culture. For instance, the issue of human development and economic growth versus protection of the environment. They are conflicting. You can have the right to the individual freedom to smoke And then the cost to society, public health. Right of the people to decide versus human rights. You can have, for instance, in Switzerland, the people, when they decide by a vote, then this is the decision. You have to, even if this decision is in contradiction with international human rights law. This is problematic. It's kind of, yeah.
Isn't it, because for me when you first mentioned first one, democracy versus Islamic dogma, I would think about the same as number 4. It's, again, it's like similar to democracy and the right to people and to decide on those versus human rights and Islamic dogma, which is mainly about values and super-constitutional principles and values.
They are related. I just separated them because here it's between two cultural spaces, between Western democracy and Islamic culture. And here we find this even the same society in Switzerland. This happens in Switzerland. I will come later.
I just wanted to mention it because for me it's the same. You know, it's not like a contradiction where it's not Islamic is against the democracy and the right for the people to decide, but it's when this might be contradicting with basic human rights or values.
Yeah. The democracy
in the general case.
The democracy issue. Yeah, I will say a few words on this issue. It's a very important issue. Democracy in Islam, it depends on what kind of democracy you are talking about. If you are talking about the philosophical ground of democracy, that says that the ultimate, the sovereignty is to the people. This is the fundamental ground of democracy. Then this is in contradiction with the Islamic conception of sovereignty. It says that the ultimate sovereignty is to God, not to the people. But it doesn't mean that the choice, that the people doesn't have the choice to elect the rulers. So when it comes now to instrumental democracy, to the mechanisms that allow to regulate and to manage the political life, then there is no contradiction between the two systems. Because in the Islamic system also there is the belief that we have to go through a system of election and allow the people to choose their rulers and to evaluate them and to destitute them when they fail. That's the only thing I mean when I talk about as a philosophy. And that's this difference between the democracy as a philosophy and democracy as a mechanism of regulating the political life. This distinction makes or leads to different views within the Islamic community of scholars. That's why you hear some Muslim scholars saying that democracy is kufr, is disbelief. And others say, no, democracy is Islamic, is complying with Islamic law or Islamic principles. Because the first group is talking about philosophy that excludes God from the realm of human activity and human life. And the other group is looking at democracy as a technical tools to regulate the political life. Yes?
And it's also about the interpretation of these divine principles. So there can be the belief that the divine principles, they are fixed, but then you have to interpret it. That's why in these different Islamic countries you have different family laws, you have different penal laws. That they're not the same, otherwise you would have one and the same law everywhere, but they're different. So somebody interprets it, somebody not changes it, but interpret it for the local context. And this can be done in a democratic procedure.
Yeah.
But if you are listening to the talk by Francis, he said almost the same thing. You know, the divine freedom belongs to God, and democracy is perverted by human beings, by power, and now Francis is perceived as a Marxist. You know,
Yes.
interpretation.
Yeah. Okay. You remember these events? Huh? Related, that fit with this, contradiction between respect of the state and freedom of speech, or freedom of speech versus the right not to be insulted. That's what
doesn't have to do a bit as well with this tradition, or as I would thought, it also has to do with the tradition in Islam that you don't make any pictures of God or of Muhammad. Or is that wrong? Am I completely? I mean, there
it depends on which school.
It's different. I mean, in Judaism and Islam, you don't really use the pictures in the same way, at least. As you do this in a Christian tradition, or you are allowed to do this in a Christian.
In Sunni,
even within Christianity,
in Sunni Islam, you're right. It's not allowed, but in Shia Islam, they're not right. But this is one thing. But the other thing is the content.
The main issue probably was around the conflict you described. Yeah. I just wanted to ask because I always thought
but of course
there is a double layer coming into it.
It adds to the problem. So all of this, it shows that there is, on one side, people who believe that we can say whatever we want, we can draw whatever we want. There's no limit to the freedom of expression. And people who say that there are spheres where we can't, the freedom of speech doesn't operate. And if you look, it doesn't mean that the first group who believes in but because usually we think in a binary way. We think that people who are for the respect of the sacred are against the freedom of expression. And that people who are for the freedom of expression are against it. It's not always true. It's only a matter of scaling the priorities or the... here I draw a table where I show that if we take, for instance, the Western culture and the Muslim culture, and you look at the freedom of expression and religious symbols, you see that freedom of expression has a high importance for the majority in Western culture. And I say for the majority. And also for, and if you take religious symbols, you find that they have high importance for the majority in the Muslim culture. And this can be explained here by the long democratic tradition, the base of human rights, and here because the influence of religion in all aspects of life. This is something taken for granted. There is no separation between private and public life. Everything, all the conduct of the human being should comply to religious guidelines. And there was no oppression by the clergy. If you, on the other hand, if you look at the Western culture, you see that there is a low importance for the majority for religious symbols. Because the religious history, the church-state clashes, and the advent of secularism. And on the other side, for the Muslim culture, you have low importance for the majority for freedom of expression because of the political history, long-lasting dictatorships, oppression, repression, etc. Yes?
Just a question. If you added a third column and said Arab culture, what would that look different than Muslim?
Do you see what I'm saying? Or can you separate the two? Maybe you can.
Well,
Or if you take different parts of the world that are Muslim, but they're also Nigerian or whatever.
well, the Arabs are a minority in the Muslim world, as you know. The Arab worlds are about 250 to 300 million, and the Muslim world is about 1.6 billion. 1.6 billion. So it's a tiny minority, and the Arabs are not all Muslims.
Well, that's why I'm making a distinction.
You have Christians, you have Jews, you have other religions. But here,
I would like to say that actually in France, freedom of speech is used also to insult people. You know, recently a French magazine called Express published in the front page a portrait of French minister, woman, and the title was L'emmerdeuse. I don't know.
Right.
Yes. This is an insult, you know, and the French people don't agree with that. Neither for Muslim country, neither culture, neither for women.
you know, this is
perversion of freedom of expression.
This is one factor that increases the feeling within the Muslim communities that there are double standards in dealing with this. You know, I come back to this the Danish newspaper. You know, before they published these drawings, cartoons, I think 1 week or 2 weeks before, the newspaper received cartoons on Jesus Christ. And the editor-in-chief refused to publish them. This is, you can find it, I can find the reference. It was published in the Danish. And the reason why, it was because he said we don't want to hurt our readers by publishing this kind of... in Britain, at the same time where we had this this video clip in 2012, there was a French newspaper who published something on the Queen. It was censored in the UK. Because you don't have the right to say anything, to say bad things on the Queen, on Her Majesty.
It's a recent example also, the same way. Recently, Human Rights Watch used a portrait of Dalai Lama against torture, a very bad picture. And people said, no, we don't accept that. So they retired the portrait, and they made excuses.
So there are always, limits to freedom.
Yes, of course. But this is not freedom of expression. This is perversion of freedom of expression. This is not freedom of expression.
You're right.
I think what I'm having trouble with that graph, and maybe I should just apply it here, but
no.
I have a problem. I mean, for myself, I'm a Christian. That's my base of belief. And when I look at Western culture, and then I compare it to Muslim culture, I would be more inclined to look at Christian culture, Muslim culture, Jewish culture, the religious base of people, and then make it a subset of West or...
It's an oversimplifying, I agree with you.
Okay.
What I mean by is secular Western culture.
Okay.
I'll tell you a short story that goes in this. In the workshops we organize in our foundation, we bring some what are called difficult political actors that are entering the scene of politics, and we work particularly with what is called Salafi movements, who set up political parties and are participating in political life, which is a good thing because it's better for them to be part of the democratic and the political not game, I don't like game, the word game, but the political life, and to be excluded and to be pushed to other ways of action. And in some of our workshops we organize the exchanges between those Salafi movements from different countries to share experiences. And also we expose them to Westerners. And when I say Westerners, we choose some Salafi Christians. I call Salafi Christians. Some evangelicals from the States or from Ireland. People who went through the same process. They were doing predication and missionary action. And then at some point they decided to do politics. And they had this challenge to go from the discourse of predication to the political discourse. And it's not easy because you are not equipped with that. And the Salafi in the Arab world are confronting this challenge. So it was a good experience to let them take benefit from this American and Irish experience. But at the end of the workshops, we felt that we were converging or going to a sort of coalition of Salafis from Christian. So I told them, please, we are not setting a federation of international Salafis here. The idea is to allow the Arab Salafis to master the political discourse in order to be equipped to deal in a proper way with other ideological movements, with secularists, with leftists, with other. So, democracy, human rights. Sometimes there are clashes. And I think the best example is this votation, like the Swiss used to call it, or vote, about the ban of the minarets. This happened in 2009, I think October, November 2009. And well, there was the extreme right-wing party used this to launch this. It was a popular initiative. Huh? You are aware of the political system in Switzerland. So anybody can collect signatures in order to propose an amendment of the law, and then nobody was expecting that this movement would succeed to have a yes vote on this issue. Even the movement who launched they were surprised. But at the end of the vote, the law passed and they amended the constitution. And now there is a law, an article of the law in the constitution that bans the construction of new minarets in Switzerland.
What's a minaret? I'm sorry.
The light.
Like the towers on the edge.
The towers,
the towers. We look quite a lot like that.
I will show you. It's just to say, and this is in conflict with international human rights law. But you have the legitimacy of the popular vote. So how to deal with that?
Which law?
Huh?
There is an international law, something that is.
Of course, you have to practice. You are free to practice your religion and to build and to have places where you practice it.
Discrimination.
What about the construction, the architecture?
No, but nobody can forbid you from constructing a religious temple or mosque as you wish to do it. If you think that it has to be constructed in that way to comply with your, but of course, you have to do it in good intelligence with the environment. Yes?
In addition to that, it's even against our own constitution because discrimination is forbidden as well. So this is targeting one community, which is clear discrimination. So there's even a contradiction now in our own constitution.
Yes?
The deeper conflict seems to be a conflict of the Age of Enlightenment and counter-enlightenment, where science and religion. And I think it was Nietzsche said that God is dead and we have killed him. And it seems to be that imbalance. I know in our Constitution it says we're endowed by our Creator with some inalienable rights. So there's kind of a balance between the metaphysical and reason. And in fact, Jefferson even had his own Bible. He extracted all the miracles, right? And, but we still have this struggle in the United States with even the story of evolution. You know, I mean, one group wants Genesis description of creation. Yeah. So I mean, I don't think it's just between Islam.
No. And even, you know, the Swiss Constitution starts with "in the name of God."
Yeah.
Like the American, God we trust.
And I think the greatest conflict probably we experienced in the 20th century was, I mean, atheism. I mean, Hitler was an atheist, Stalin was an atheist, Mussolini was an atheist. And there was, like Nietzsche said, there was a desire to extract all religion from society. So it's, I think, an ongoing conflict.
I wonder why you say there's a conflict related to values, because, for example, the minaret example, the scarf example less, because that discussion and that debate is specifically about any religious symbolism in schools, not just the scarf. But the minarets, I think it's more a conflict related to fear, because if actually you want to forbid something for one religious group and not for the other, you don't have respect for your own constitution, and that seems to be the value that is always pronounced in Western countries. Like
you are explaining here. I will come to that later on. I will explain what are the reasons. The fear is the main reason. But what I describe here is that we have two values. We have one value, which is that the popular will is sovereign. When the people decide, it's done. This is a value. The Swiss people agree on that. And we have direct democracy. We say, nothing can happen against the will of the people. And when the people want something or desire something and votes for it, then the authorities have to comply.
I'm sorry,
but
and then the second value is human rights. Is if you believe in the Bill of Human Rights or the International Law of Human Rights, then you should comply to it also. So when you are in a situation where you have a clash between the two, I view it as a conflict of values.
Yeah, that's what I say. I mean, your will has certain limits. It's not, I mean, what people decide has to have certain limits in the sense that there are some rules. Here it says, I mean, I'm guessing it's not in the case of Switzerland, but in the case of other European countries, international law is stronger than national law. So even if we decide to do something, if it's yes, we cannot do it.
Now the Swiss, they are reviewing the process and they are trying to find a better way to do it. And this is, they should have done it for this vocation. And the way to do it is to check if the initiative, if the popular initiative comply with international before accepting it for a vote.
And with the scarf in France, we have also the same problem, you know, because the law said the scarf is forbidden, and the European Court confirmed that. So the international law confirmed the national law.
Wow, it's not international law.
No, but it's about all religious institutions by the government.
It's not only about scarf, but all religious.
So that's not this country.
Yeah, but it's civil state, so let's say you don't discriminate one against another, you discriminate all of them. So easy discrimination then.
And in public-based schools, if you go to a religious school, you can do whatever you want. So it's not really discrimination. It's not really nice, but.
Okay, let's try to understand what happened for this vote. So the pros, they thought that the minaret symbolizes the number one, reference to the oneness of God. That it has the shape of the letter Alif, A in Arabic, rank of knowledge in the mosque, and it's an index pointing to heaven, reminder of that. The cons, see it as a sign of power showing the aggressive character of Islam, a phallic symbol indicating the patriarchy that subjugates women, symbolizes a missile pointing to the west.
It's the same about churches. I mean, basically the same shape.
Be patient, like.
You're stealing his thunder, I think.
You are running faster than my. Yeah, we forget that the minaret comes from churches. The first minaret was built 8 years after the death of the Prophet. And it's a Byzantine influence. It's an influence from Byzantine churches. Both the minaret and the dome. This is a mosque. This is a Byzantine style of church in Greece. So the mosque was influenced by the church. This minaret in Arabic we call it manara, meaning lighthouse, because it was used also for public lighting during night. Yeah. And then mi'vana, because it's the place where the man who calls for prayer goes up in order to have to voice his the call. And it's called also in North Africa, it's called Sawma'a, and Sawma'a means hermitage, it means Christian hermitage. You know, because of this influence from him. And it's not the only influence actually. Even the rosary was transferred to the Muslims, and the Muslims use it now either in this shape of 33 or in this 99, referring to the 99 attributes of God. Now, yeah.
Can I add something?
Yes,
Because,
please.
this was my main argument when I was mentioning that with the minarets, for me, it's not something that is important,
it's not
because
essential.
it's not essential to
It's not
the
essential.
mosque.
Yeah.
And I believe that this goes again to what you referred as B types of conflict. It's just people believe that it's a religious conflict, and this is something that is among our identity and our core practice. But the main issues are maybe their freedom in these countries and their fairness to have rights as a minority groups.
Yeah, you know, I still have a few words for this.
We have about 15 minutes left.
Okay. Maybe we'll skip the Arab revolutions and you will have them on.
That's more interesting.
What? The Arab revolution?
That's more interesting than discussion.
Yeah.
You know, the results of the votations. There were many analyses of the results of the votes. And what we discovered is that, you know, people who voted for this law, they live in regions where they don't have any Muslim community. And the big cities and people where you have Muslim communities, they voted against it. And the other result shown by these studies is that the Swiss, when they were asked and they were polled, they said we have no problem with Muslims in Switzerland. They are good guys, good ladies. They are very. They comply to the Swiss way of. We have no problem at all. So what's the problem? It's the image of Islam conveyed by the media that is mainly based on international events, on war, on Afghanistan, on Iraq, on other places. The image of war, violence, destruction, etc.
Yes.
This has a big influence on the opinion. So it's about fear, as someone mentioned earlier on. It's about it's not about real problems between communities. Now, what's yes?
We are talking about maybe Muslim minorities in European countries, but what happens with Christian minorities in Muslim countries?
Same
That's very
patterns.
interesting. The same happens.
The same patterns.
And my point is that like even the citizens in the originally that come from European countries, they also have limitations. So like minorities shouldn't think that they are minority, that's why they have limitations. But people who originally live in those countries, they have also limitations. So it's not discrimination, it's just the way it works.
I didn't get the last one. So.
It's not like discrimination against minorities, but it is the way it works in everywhere.
What do you mean the way it works?
I mean, like, as you said, the same happens with Christian minorities in Islamic countries, the same happens with every minority in every country. So, like, they feel that they have limited...
Yeah, but this is a descriptive, we're describing, this is not a normalizing statement. When you say it's the normal way, it should be.
I would say it's normal way, but it is the way it is.
Ah, okay, yeah.
But discriminative then everywhere.
Yes.
Of course.
There's no monopoly.
Normal discrimination.
We work on this, as I told you, we work on Coptic Muslim tensions in Egypt. So we work also on contexts where we have Christian minorities with Muslim majorities. And if you want to, we could talk later on about all the problems that are there. But here I just picked up a few examples that came to mind. And the following slides are about how. First, one question. What does the word Islamophobia mean for you?
Fear only. Fear, but not against Islam, against fundamentalism. There is a kind of confusion between Islam and Islam.
Yeah, do you agree with that?
Literally translated, it's fear of Islam.
Fear of Islam.
And I mean, it would, according to the explanation we get from this minaret analysis, it would be rather really not, if Swiss voters say, oh, we don't have any trouble with Islamic people in our country, then I would rather say it's fear of Islam and not just because of Islamistic. I mean, there are very few experiences you probably can make in Switzerland of some Islamists.
Anyway, this is exactly what I wanted to show, is that we have to differentiate between attitudes. And often the Muslims, they mix everything, they put everything in the same basket and don't differentiate. And in having this mixed assessment of actions, they react in an improper way and non-efficient way. And this can be applied in other contexts also. I mean, where you have Christian minority looking at the behavior of a Muslim community. You have always to analyze the behavior or the attitude and see what is behind. If it is a fear from Islam, or if it's from political Islam, or from fundamentalism. And here I would like to show you categories of attitudes that are sometimes mixed up. It's about Western attitudes and behaviors negatively perceived by Muslims. The first one, I call it Islam criticism. And by Islam criticism, I mean challenging Islamic values from a Western, secular, or call it whatever you want. And it's about methodology, and it's legitimate. I mean, a Westerner has the right to criticize some Islamic principles from his or her stand. Just like a Muslim has the right to criticize some Western, but this has to be methodological. I mean, and the best way to deal with this kind of critiques is to exchange and to have dialogue and debates and argue and yeah.
Just a question about the description. If we made like a decision to start describing a phenomenon in the way that is, in ways that are the same, for instance, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are from Abraham, so forth and so on. If we started describing from commonalities as opposed to differences, I think you could still term that as a Western standpoint. You know what I mean? Am I making any sense now? Never mind.
No, say it again.
Well, the description, it says challenging Islamic values from a Western standpoint. That almost seems like it should go on a little bit more in terms of differences.
Yeah, but what I mean by
It's
Western
different.
is a mainstream culture. I'm not talking about, of course, within this mainstream you have islands of thoughts and of course the Christians and the Jewish and the Muslims are part of the West also.
Right.
So, but here, to simplify, let's agree that what is meant by Western world is secular West.
That's where I keep getting things confused. Thank
Because
you.
it's the mainstream culture.
Thank you.
It's the mainstream in Europe, but is it the mainstream in the US?
So the West here is secular Europe. So the second category is what I call anti-Islamism. Anti-Islamism. That's opposing the interference of Islam in the public sphere, in politics, for instance. And this is the realm of politology. Here also, the only way to do things is to deal with that is through dialogue. A Muslim will argue that Islam asks us to be Muslims in private and public life, and the West secular European will say, no, the politic has to be freed from religion. And then through dialogue, maybe they get to a common ground or not. But dialogue. The third category is anti-Islamism, which is different. And here it's opposing Islam from religious dogmatic grounds. This is the realm of theology. And here, these are not seculars who are, but religious, Christian priests and theology, same thing, dialogue, exchange, interfaith dialogue, that sort of thing. The fourth one is Islamophobia. Islamophobia is an irrational fear or prejudice towards Islam and Muslims. This is the realm of psychology. And here again, dialogue and dialogue and dialogue. Number 5, Islamo-racism. And this is about viewing Muslims as an alien invasive race and discriminating them. Ideology, dialogue. And here, you know, it's about also this kind of you know attitude is used by some unions and political movements and to say that the Muslims are here, they take your jobs and they take your all these problems of integration and immigration and then number 6, you have Muslim provocation. This is a vicious attitude and aggressive behavior, and this is purely pathology. There are people who are sick, and they want to provoke just for you. And here the attitude is to be indifferent or to recourse to legal means, but not to violence. And the last category is Muslim manipulation. And this is an opportunistic induction of Muslims' violent reaction to serve personal or collective, political or economic goals. And this is about strategy. There is a strategy behind it. And here, the only way to react to that is through non-violence resistance. So you had a question?
This, just to be kind of contrary to this seems like a very moderate view. And it seems like a moderate view of some of the negative Western attitudes. But I hear there's a lot of extreme attitudes against Westerns too, that were infidels. I mean, a lot of extreme attitudes kind of on the far right too. And so I guess my question is this the prevailing mainstream or is the far right, I don't, you know what I mean? I just know that there's a lot of radical anti-Americanism and Westernism.
Where?
And within Islam as well.
Yeah, but as I said, you take this table and change here. You have Muslim attitudes.
Oh, you could flip it. I see.
Okay, perceived by Westerners.
Right. Okay.
And then you just.
But at the end, you can totalize all these points and in one word: ignorance. Ignorance means we have to stop criticism, to start understanding, and understanding means non-violence. Only one word: ignorance. You can replace also Islamophobia by homophobia. It's exactly the same. The same pattern in the brain. That means fear of other.
How many questions? Yeah, first.
That's interesting because recently we had another vote in Switzerland about immigration, or maybe you heard about it, in February. And of course it succeeded, same as the minorities. And the slogan of those extreme right-wing parties was "Stop to mass immigration." And left-wing parties, to contrast this, propaganda, were going around, erasing immigration on those slogans from the right-wing part, the extreme right-wing parties, and putting "Stop mass ignorance." That's precisely what
I think it's very dangerous to not be able to criticize. And I mean, this is an extreme example, but I mean, what happened in the Third Reich in Germany, which was my country, happened because people were not criticizing and understanding everything. I think there may be, there should be a principle to work towards understanding, but criticism is like very important to question things that are being presented.
Criticism, understanding include to judgment, but not to criticize. It's not the same way. Criticize is to put knowledge under understanding. There is a type of values.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a comment. My understanding is that it's the small really minor elements of groups that get the most attention. And when you say there's a lot of kind of radical language like the West is infidels, I think that just gets amplified. So we get this false impression of this mass. But in reality, it could, moderate Islam is the majority, isn't it? Like, that's my understanding. So I think that's the role of the media and the politicians in manipulating people and using fear.
So fortunately, they have the radicals. They have easier access to the media because it sells.
Yeah, exactly. This is a statement saying I would like to mention. What we say in Arabic as a proverb is there is no smoke without fire, and that there is always something that might be present, and it's about Western media and it's about spotting lights over these issues or these incidents. And there are things that we need to have also discussion about, and this, I guess, what you mentioned about with the anti-Islamism and the opposing the interference of Islam in the sphere, especially when with these radical ideas and radical behaviors from the Muslims who. So we need. There is something about it that also need to be discussed, especially with radical Islamists.
But we have to keep in mind that some of these categories are legitimate. That's important to criticizing. Yeah. For me, we believe we have a system, a worldview, a system of values, and we are in front of another worldview. I mean, there is no harm to say that I disagree with this concept. What's the? I mean, everybody is free to love something or to hate or to not to love it.
Yes, but the understanding is too open, not too close.
Yes, but even
criticize is something too close.
No, but I mean, even after a long dialogue and exchange and discussion, etc., you may come to the conclusion that you are not, that you still disagree or yeah.
Yes, and for me to say criticize or question is just a matter of semantics. It boils down to the same thing. If I am questioning, I'm at another level criticizing. And criticism is both the negative and the positive dimension. It can be constructive criticism. But a person has a right to question and criticize. We mustn't put a moral value to it. That's the way the world goes. That just
okay, we are running out of time, so we still have 10 minutes, no? Anyway, it's up to you. If you want to stop, we take more 1 or 2 minutes for discussion and then we stop. Or we take. Sorry?
No discussion. No discussion, but we want to hear about our uprising.
But I need 10 minutes of this.
Yeah.
There is a general agreement.
Yeah, if everyone keeps their questions, then we can listen the whole story.
I have the feeling it's very difficult for the group.
Let's say a few words about the Arab revolutions, or what is called the Arab revolutions, or the Arab Spring, or the causes, the challenges, and the hopes, because it's a major event in the history of the region. What's for you the mission of the state?
In general terms?
In general terms, what's the role? What is?
To serve.
What is there for? To serve the people. Okay, we agree. But it's to serve the people. In the Arab world, unfortunately, this is not the mission of the state. For decades, this has not been the mission of the state. The mission of the state for decades in the Arab world was this: to control the political power and to get monopoly of wealth. And the tools are armed forces, religious leaders, public money. In the Arab world, unfortunately, This is not the mission of the state. For decades, this has not been the mission of the state. The mission of the state for decades in the Arab world was this: to control the political power and to get monopoly of wealth. And the tools are armed forces, religious leaders, public money.
It sounds like the Catholic Church.
And the process is dictatorship to control the political power, dictatorship whatever form, you know, monarchic or military or civilian. Party, I mean civilian political party. And the process for having the monopoly of wealth is corruption. And this is the root cause of all the protests in this region. There are two words I want to introduce, and I think there is only two persons who are familiar with our Arab-speaking friends. The first one is Hogra. From Hagra, it conveys the meaning of sense of injustice and feeling of humiliation. And the other one is close to it phonetically, is Harga. This is Hogra, this is Harga. And Harga is about, literally Harga means burning. And it was used by the youth from North Africa who flee to Europe with small boats. And half of them would die in the Mediterranean. And before they go, they burn their ID, their passports, in order not to be identified in Europe. So we call them the Haraga, those who burn their ID. But it has a general meaning, Harga. It's rupture, it's about rupture, bond breaking, link burning. And duality, Hogra, Harga, is about structural violence, means no decent life, no consideration surrounding wealth, fast richness, unemployment, large-scale man-made poverty. It's important to specify. It's man-made poverty. It's not real poverty, because when you are in a poor society, but there is equity and social justice, then you stand it. You cope with it. When it's man-made, when you have rich who have billions and poor who die, who feed themselves on the garbage, then you have a problem. No political participation, electoral fraud, coercion, repression, etc. This leads to frustration, despair, hopelessness, dreamlessness, horizonlessness. This leads in turn to lack of solidarity, individualism, loneliness, forced corruption. And at the end, what we get is a passive response or a violent active response, and this is Harga. And Harga can be to quit the social and political sphere, that's retreat, citizen resignation, quit the civilian sphere and go and take arms, quit the country, immigration, brain drain, both people, or quit life, simply. Suicide, self-immolation. And the ignition of the Arab Spring was a young Tunisian who went through self-immolation, who set himself on fire. There are indicators of this vicious, Hogra, Harga, going on. It's social injustice, economic decline and deterioration of public services, militarization and population control, insult of human needs, violation of human rights, corruption, fragility, failure, delegitimization of the state, human flag. Now, how does this Hogra Harga fit together? In every society, there is no idealistic society, no ideal situation. You have always a residual Hogra and a residual Harga. So you start from this point. And then you will get a feeling of humiliation and injustice to a certain point that can be tolerated by the society. And from that, the society start to react either through passive or through violent response. Until a certain point, where we have saturation. And here, there is an inflection, a moment where there is a trigger for change, where you transform, where there is transformations within society, and you move from passivity or from violent reaction to a non-violent resistance to the structural violence. This is really what I described as a metaphysical experience. And I felt it in early 2011 like a metaphysical experience.
I wrote a book about that, exactly.
Yeah.
But everywhere, not only on Arab
countries, sure.
But we have the same pattern in Tibet, in India also, everywhere, but also in Europe,
Yeah. So it's really a sublimation of about political transition and challenges, very rapidly. Transition is usually from a corrupt despotic regime to the rule of law and good governance. So there are two parameters to describe life in society. It's freedom and wealth. We can describe the society by taking into account those two parameters. So either you live in hell with no freedom and no wealth, and you want to go to heaven with freedom and wealth. So you can dream to do it directly, and but this is difficult. Usually the process is indirect. So you start by going to heaven, which is half hell, half heaven. So you can do it either ways. You can go and get freedom, and then think of wealth. And this is what happened in the Arab Spring. The populations, they went to the streets and they asked for freedom. And bread, I don't, my friend from Egypt, also there was aish, bread. But the first is karam, dignity and freedom. Or you can do it the other way. You look for wealth, and then you look for freedom. And here we have examples of countries who adopted this model. Yeah, economic growth, you lift up the society, and then you open the political. These are two transitions. To succeed, this first transition, the liberation and development, need good governance. If you don't have good governance, then you have a society that was freed, liberated, but then the risk is that it will come back to dictatorship, because people need a decent life. And if they don't have a decent life, they will. It can be reversed. The other transition requires an enlightened dictator. In the Arab world, unfortunately, we don't have this kind of dictator. Maybe in South, I don't know, South Korea, maybe Singapore. Yeah. Well, just another way of looking at things. Always the types of transition you have, either using violence or non-violence. The actor might be the state, the opposition, or an external actor. Here you have the military coup, if it's the state and using violence. Opposition, violence, that's armed resistance. External high violence, that's military intervention. State non-violence, that's handover. I mentioned Spain. Here you can think of Iraq, for instance. External military intervention. Opposition non-violence, that's civil resistance. External non-violence, that's soft persuasion, but up to now I can't think of an example of that.
The civil resistance, you can think of Green Movement in Iran.
And the challenges, I gave this list of challenges in 2011. And unfortunately some of them came true. First challenge is to resist the counter-revolution. And the counter-revolution actors are internal from the countries, within the countries, the old regime. They might be neighboring countries. For instance, in the Arab world now, the regional countries who are contributing in supporting the counter-revolution clearly are Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Algeria. They are doing all they can. They are putting money. They are putting, everything in order to, so that the changes in Egypt, in Libya, in Tunisia fail. Or international actors also who are not happy with the changes. The other challenge is about is that when you are in transition, when you have liberated the country from the dictatorship, you are left with many challenges, dealing with the past, with the present, and with the future. With the present, because you have to guarantee the needs, the basic needs of people. You have to produce wealth, to protect it from corruption, and to distribute it fairly. This is not an easy task.
First step of the pyramid of Maslow.
Yeah.
Not at the top, but at the bottom.
And then you have also to take care of the past and to clear all the what is left from the past, all the injuries, the traumas, the psychological and social, consequences of the conflict. And here you have to look at the distant and recent past, engage in a genuine reconciliation, try to imagine a common future, a positive, constructive way of living together, including the people from the old regimes, not excluding them, because excluding them will push them to the corner and they will come stronger and then also to build institutions. So these are real challenges, and we see that the Arab countries who went through these revolutions are really having great difficulties to overcome them. Another challenge is to get used to conflict management by arms, and we see that in Libya, unfortunately. And another challenge is egoism, individual or collective. This is about self-sufficiency and rejection of the other, failure to reach a minimum agreement. And this is, for instance, what happened, maybe you correct me if I'm wrong, what happened in Egypt. When the Brotherhood, they took the power, they thought that they could run the country alone. And this was a big mistake. But this doesn't justify the military intervention, to be honest. This mistake of the Brotherhood, that it had to be corrected through democratic process. The people were able, we have to trust the people. The people, they would change peacefully through the ballot box. I'm sure if they left the situation until the next election, the Brotherhood, maybe they would have lost the election. I think it's the last slide. Thank you very much for your attention. If I didn't consume consume my 10 minutes, then we'll maybe allow for one question of
I think it's better we stop now because we have a short break. Thank you very much for this interesting lecture.
It was not a lecture, it was sharing experience.
For sharing experience.
Thank you very much for your dynamism and inputs. It was really a living discussion. I like it very much.
Yeah, thank you. And two more things. We have the evaluation form. And we please fill it out and bring it back in the afternoon. And we talked about the criticism. We like constructive. So we will give it around. The other thing is the luggage. It would be good if you could go back to your rooms, take out the luggage just before lunch.
Yes.
Where do we
And then
put
you
it?
can start.
No luggage, no luggage.
Where do we put it?